Behind that '70s show's most famous couple lies a disturbing corporate secret. Network executives knew Mila Kunis was 14, while Ashton Kutcher was 19. Yet instead of protecting a young teen, the rating machine mandated an on-screen romance to generate tens of millions in ad revenue. Hollywood uses their real-life marriage today as the ultimate PR shield to hide this massive ethical breach. But the truth exposes the darkest side of the '90s studio system. The Los Angeles television industry operates on a foundation of carefully constructed illusions. When a multi-camera sitcom broadcasts into millions of living rooms, the audience is meant to see a self-contained world, a living room, a high school, or a wood-paneled basement in Wisconsin. What they do not see is the corporate machinery required to sustain that illusion. They do not see the production schedules, the advertising mandates, the labor contracts, or the specific, often unforgiving demographics dictated by network executives. In the late 1990s, the Fox Broadcasting Network was searching for a very specific product. They needed a youth-oriented comedy to capture a highly lucrative advertising demographic. The project that would eventually become that '70s show was greenlit to fill this exact corporate need. It required an ensemble cast of fresh, unknown faces to play a group of high school students. But to understand the ethical compromises that occurred on the sound stages of Studio City in 1998, it is necessary to examine the origins of the two actors who would become the show's breakout stars. Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher did not come from Hollywood lineages. They possessed no industry connections or structural protection. They entered the casting process driven by entirely different, yet equally urgent socioeconomic realities. Mila Kunis was born in August 1983 in Chernivtsi, a city in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Her early childhood coincided with the terminal decline of the Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, the region was characterized by severe economic stagnation and rising systemic anti-Semitism. For her parents, Mark, a mechanical engineer, and Elvira, a physics teacher, remaining in Ukraine was no longer a viable option for their family's survival. In 1991, as the Soviet bloc was dissolving, the Kunis family secured religious refugee visas. They left their homeland with a government-mandated limit of $250. Upon arriving in the United States, they eventually settled in Los Angeles. The reality of this migration was stark. Mark and Elvira Kunis's Soviet degrees held no weight in California. To keep their family afloat, they immediately transitioned into low-wage labor. Mark drove a taxi cab and delivered pizzas. Elvira worked in the back room of a thrifty drugstore. Mila, 7 years old, was placed into a public elementary school without knowing a single word of English. In this context, acting was not introduced to Mila Kunis as an artistic pursuit. It was a pragmatic tool. Her parents enrolled her in an after-school acting program at the Beverly Hills Studios, strictly to help her learn English and assimilate by interacting with American children. It was there that a talent manager, Susan Curtis, noticed her capability to perform comfortably in front of adults. Curtis approached the Kunis family with a proposition: representation for commercial auditions. For the Kunis family, a television commercial represented a sudden, substantial influx of American currency. Mila began booking jobs. She shot advertisements for Barbie dolls and Lisa Frank products. By the time she entered her early teens, she was a working professional. The income she generated was not treated as disposable allowance. It was a serious contribution to a family still establishing its financial footing in a new country. She learned early that her presence on a set was a job tied directly to a paycheck. 2,000 miles east in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Ashton Kutcher was navigating a different kind of working-class environment. Born in February 1978 into a conservative Catholic family, his formative years were defined by a persistent medical crisis. His fraternal twin brother Michael was born with cerebral palsy and later developed severe cardiomyopathy, eventually requiring a heart transplant. The psychological and financial weight of Michael's condition shaped the Kutcher household. Ashton spent his teenage years working a succession of physically demanding jobs to generate his own income. He swept the factory floors at a General Mills plant and worked in manual construction. His worldview was highly localized, focused on practical survival and blue-collar labor. After graduating high school, Kutcher enrolled at the University of Iowa. His declared major was biochemical engineering, a choice motivated by a desire to understand and potentially cure his brother's heart condition. To pay his tuition, he continued working menial jobs and occasionally sold his blood plasma. He had no theatrical background and no intention of pursuing the entertainment industry. His trajectory shifted abruptly in 1997. While at a bar in Iowa City, Kutcher was approached by a talent scout who encouraged him to enter a local modeling competition. He entered and won. The prize included a trip to New York City for the International Modeling and Talent Association convention. Kutcher dropped out of university, relocated briefly to New York to work in print modeling, and then flew to Los Angeles to audition for television roles. He arrived in California in 1998. He was 20 years old, physically imposing, but possessing zero experience in navigating the complex legal and social hierarchies of network television. At this exact time, casting directors in Los Angeles were beginning a nationwide search for the pilot of that 70s show. The characters of Jackie Burkhart, a wealthy, demanding cheerleader, and Michael Kelso, a handsome but dim-witted teenager, were central to the script's comedic engine. When casting a high school ensemble, major studios operate under a strict, unspoken industry standard known as 18 to play younger. This rule is not based on acting ability. It is a financial and legal safeguard. The state of California enforces rigorous child labor laws to protect minors in the entertainment industry. If a production hires an actor under the age of 18, they must comply with a heavily regulated framework. The studio must hire a state-mandated welfare worker to be on set at all times. The minors' working hours are strictly capped, requiring mandatory rest periods and blocks of time dedicated to schooling. A parent or guardian must be present on the lot. Furthermore, a portion of the minor's wages must be placed into a blocked Coogan trust account. For television producers tasked with delivering a weekly multi-camera sitcom, time is the most expensive commodity on the lot. Accommodating a minor's legal requirements slows down production significantly. An 18-year-old actor, however, can legally work the grueling 14 to 16-hour days standard in network television. They do not require a studio teacher. They are, from a corporate perspective, infinitely cheaper and easier to manage. Mila Kunis, at 14 years old, was already a veteran of the audition circuit. She understood the 18 to play younger mandate perfectly. She knew that if she disclosed her actual birth year of 1983, her resume would be immediately discarded by the casting department. When she secured an audition for the role of Jackie Burkhart, she employed a specific, calculated evasion. When the casting directors asked her age, she stated that she would be 18 on her birthday. She intentionally omitted the year in which that specific birthday would take place. It was a technicality, a survival tactic utilized by a working teenager to bypass an administrative hurdle and secure a lucrative contract. The casting directors focused on her sharp comedic timing and the confident, arrogant energy she brought to the read, accepted the answer without immediate verification. Simultaneously, Ashton Kutcher walked into the Fox casting offices. He had virtually no acting resume to present. However, his audition for Michael Kelso demonstrated a natural aptitude for physical comedy. The producers recognized that his genuine, somewhat naive Midwestern demeanor perfectly suited the character. They hired the 20-year-old immediately. The network had found their core cast. The pilot was officially greenlit. Contracts were drafted. But a verbal evasion in an audition room cannot survive the bureaucratic finalization process of a major corporation. Before production insurance can be issued and employment contracts legally bound, human resources departments require government-issued identification. Passports and birth certificates must be photocopied and filed. As the paperwork for the newly cast ensemble moved through the Fox legal department, the administrative process ran its course. The executives opened Mila Kunis's file to process her contract. They looked at the verified date of birth. The actress they had just hired to play a highly mature high school cheerleader. The actress, written to be the primary romantic partner of a 20-year-old adult man, was not 17. She was not on the verge of turning 18. She was 14 years old. The discovery of Mila Kunis's actual age did not occur in a vacuum. It happened within the highly structured, legally liable environment of the Fox network's human resources and legal departments. In the spring of 1998, the production of that 70s show was confronted with a definitive administrative crisis. The actress they had contracted to play Jackie Burkhart was a 14-year-old middle school student. At this juncture, standard industry protocol presented the network with a clear path. Kunis had secured the position through a deliberate omission during the casting process. Legally, the studio had immediate grounds for termination based on breach of contract or misrepresentation. Recasting the role with an actor who was legally 18 would have instantly resolved the massive logistical burdens associated with California child labor laws. It would have also neutralized the profound ethical issue of pairing a 14-year-old child with a 20-year-old adult man in a highly scripted, adult-oriented storyline. However, the decision-making process at a major broadcasting network is rarely dictated by moral philosophy. It is driven by data and financial projections. Before committing resources to a full season, Fox conducted extensive test screenings of the pilot episode. The data returned by these monitored audiences was conclusive. The comedic chemistry between Kunis and Ashton Kutcher registered exceptionally high. Viewers responded positively to the dynamic between the abrasive, fast-talking Jackie and the gullible, physically expressive Kelso. The network executives, alongside series creators Bonnie Turner, Terry Turner, and Mark Brazil, evaluated the test scores against the legal liabilities. They calculated that the specific pairing of these two actors was a critical component of the show's potential commercial success. Consequently, Fox made a calculated corporate decision. They elected to absorb the logistical costs of employing a minor. They retained Kunis on the payroll. Crucially, however, they did not instruct the writers' room to alter the established character dynamics. Production was ordered to proceed exactly as originally designed. The implementation of this decision fundamentally altered the working environment on the sound stages in Studio City. Because Kunis was 14, the production was now legally required to integrate a state-mandated welfare worker, a studio teacher, into the daily shooting schedule. Her working hours under the lights were strictly capped. Mandatory schooling blocks of at least 3 hours a day had to be factored into the production timeline. Furthermore, a parent or legal guardian was required to be present on the lot. This created a severe operational dichotomy. The basement set was dressed to resemble a relaxed 1970s teenage hangout, but the atmosphere behind the cameras was dictated by rigid legal compliance and high-pressure corporate schedules. For Ashton Kutcher, the realization of his co-star's actual age required an immediate psychological adjustment. He had relocated from Iowa and navigated the casting process under the assumption that he was working alongside peers, fellow young adults entering the professional industry. When he was informed that his on-screen girlfriend was a 14-year-old who required a studio teacher and parental supervision, the dynamic shifted entirely. Kutcher was 20 years old. He had lived independently, attended university, and worked in factories. Kunis was navigating her early teenage years and completing middle school assignments between takes. Recognizing the massive discrepancy in their life experiences, Kutcher established a strict, platonic boundary off-camera. During the extensive downtime required to adjust lighting and camera angles for a multi-camera sitcom, their interactions were strictly fraternal. He frequently assisted her with her science and math homework. He interacted with her parents, who were a constant presence on the set. This off-camera dynamic was entirely appropriate for two colleagues separated by 5 years of fundamental developmental growth. However, that boundary was systematically breached by the requirements of their employment contracts. In the hierarchical structure of network television, actors, particularly young, newly contracted series regulars, occupy the lowest tier of operational power. They possess no authority to veto the writer's room, argue with the director's blocking, or challenge the showrunners. Their primary function is to execute the scripts they are handed. The scripts delivered to the cast of that 70s show consistently demanded romantic interactions between Jackie and Kelso. The characters were written to engage in frequent close proximity and execute on-screen affectionate scenes. Neither Kunis nor Kutcher had the industry leverage or the financial security to refuse the material. Kunis, acutely aware of her family's economic reliance on her income, was focused entirely on job retention. She viewed the older actors around her with a level of intimidation and sought to prove her professional competency. The execution of their first major romantic scene illustrates the clinical, uncomfortable reality of the production. For Kunis, it was her first kiss in real life. It was not a private milestone. It was a highly monitored workplace requirement, performed under studio lighting, surrounded by camera operators, sound technicians, producers, her studio teacher, and her parents. Kutcher was fully cognizant of the legal and ethical boundaries he was being paid to cross. He expressed clear discomfort regarding the age gap, navigating the anxiety of performing a scripted relationship with a minor while adhering to the directions of the adult crew running the set. They performed the scene as instructed. The footage was captured, the director called cut, and the production schedule moved forward to the next setup. As the first season progressed through 1998 and into 1999, an intense culture of cognitive dissonance settled over the production. The set was managed entirely by adults. The network executives, the legal representatives, the writers, the directors, and the mandated welfare workers were all fully aware of the precise ages of the two performers. They all read the scripts requiring a 20-year-old man to act as the boyfriend of a 14-year-old. Yet the operational machinery continued without interruption. The welfare worker ensured compliance with educational hours, but had no jurisdiction over the content of the scripts. The writers generated comedic scenarios that capitalized on the characters' toxic relationship, utilizing the highly artificial pacing of the sitcom format to mask the underlying reality. The intrusion of a canned laugh track served as an audio cue, signaling to the audience that the interactions were strictly comedic and perfectly acceptable. By refusing to acknowledge the ethical implications of their casting decision, the network established a localized workplace culture where the show's financial trajectory superseded the psychological comfort of the cast. The actors absorbed this environment. Lacking the structural power to object, Kunis and Kutcher adapted. Kunis, in particular, developed a profound level of compartmentalization. To survive the awkwardness and the alienation of her dual life, she had to adapt. She was working a high-stakes corporate job in the morning and attending a public high school in the afternoon. Therefore, she surgically separated her own identity from the character of Jackie. She trained herself to view the close contact blocking required on set purely as a technical maneuver, no different than hitting a tape mark on the floor or memorizing a cue. When that 70s show premiered in August 1998, precisely as Kunis turned 15, the Fox network's strategy proved highly effective. The program was broadcast globally. The audience, lacking access to the behind-the-scenes data regarding the actors' ages, consumed the show exactly as intended. They responded positively to the Jackie and Kelso dynamic. The media landscape of the late 1990s did not feature the rapid critical feedback loops of modern internet culture. Entertainment journalists and television critics largely accepted the product at face value. The corporate gamble had paid off. The show was a certified hit, generating substantial advertising revenue. Fox locked the cast into long-term syndication contracts. Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher were now firmly integrated into the infrastructure of a massive television franchise, legally obligated to continue their mandated dynamic for the foreseeable future, while the media machinery began to aggressively market their faces to the world. As the calendar turned from 1999 into the early 2000s, the initial administrative shock of the network's ethical compromise settled into a relentless, exhausting daily operational protocol. That 70s show was no longer merely a successful pilot. It had evolved into a bona fide cultural phenomenon and a foundational pillar of Fox's primetime lineup. The network, recognizing the massive financial value of their property, aggressively mobilized its marketing division. The cast was thrust into a grueling promotional circuit designed to maximize viewership and lock in advertising rates. Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher, as the central romantic pairing of the series, became primary targets for this marketing machinery. They were routinely featured on the covers of youth-oriented publications like Teen People and sent on nationwide press tours. Network publicists meticulously managed their appearances, instructing them to sit side by side in television interviews and discuss their on-screen relationship. The objective was clear: sell the chemistry that the executives had banked on to millions of viewers. This promotional requirement necessitated a profound level of psychological compartmentalization, particularly for Kunis. At 15 and 16 years old, she was navigating a highly public split-screen existence. During the week, she functioned as a working professional on a major studio lot, executing camera blocking, mastering multi-camera comedic timing, and holding her own against seasoned veteran actors. She was earning a substantial salary and operating within a high-stakes studio structure. Yet, when the director called rap, she was abruptly thrust back into the reality of her biological age. She was still enrolled as a student at Fairfax High School in Los Angeles. The whiplash between these two environments was severe. She would spend her morning executing a script that required her to perform complex fictional scenarios alongside an older castmate, and she would spend her afternoon sitting in a fluorescent-lit classroom, attempting to complete algebra assignments alongside teenagers who were obsessively watching her on television. To survive this alienation, Kunis developed an impenetrable emotional armor. The on-camera character interactions, which had begun as a source of intense anxiety and professional pressure in 1998, were rapidly stripped of all emotional weight. She conditioned herself to view these scripted requirements on set strictly as a technical requirement of her employment contract. It became clinical, a physical mark to hit before moving on to the next scene. She surgically separated Mila, the high school student, from Jackie, the highly marketable television asset. Ashton Kutcher was experiencing his own form of cultural whiplash. In his early 20s, he was suddenly wealthy, globally recognized, and navigating the relentless pressure cooker of young Hollywood. The entertainment industry immediately attempted to typecast him based on his sitcom persona, assuming he possessed the same dim-witted traits as Michael Kelso. It was a stereotype he strategically leaned into for professional survival, masking a sharp, ambitious intellect that was already calculating his next career moves. Despite his rapidly expanding external life, when Kutcher returned to the Fox lot every week, he maintained the strict protective dynamic he had established with Kunis. Acutely aware of the industry's unforgiving nature, he actively functioned as a shield for his younger co-star. He monitored her interactions on set, offered advice, and treated her with the respect of a trusted colleague while maintaining the protective instinct of an older sibling. They were closely allied by the unconventional television landscape they were trapped within, relying on each other for psychological grounding in a workplace that had its own set of unusual industry standards. This genuine platonic care made the execution of their on-screen relationship increasingly surreal. The writers, operating from their offices above the sound stages, continued to accelerate the fictional storyline between Jackie and Kelso. As Kunis aged through her mid-teens, the scripts did not dial back the physical intimacy. They intensified it to match the standard pacing of adult television dramas. The writers generated complex, highly toxic adult relationship dynamics for a girl who could not legally drive a car. They scripted storylines revolving around infidelity, complex emotional manipulation, and adult relationship crises. However, the dawn of the new millennium brought a definitive legally binding shift to the sound stages in Studio City. In August 2001, Mila Kunis turned 18. The legal restrictions that had hovered over the production for 3 years vanished overnight. The state of California no longer classified her as a minor. The mandate for a studio teacher was dissolved. The heavily restricted working hours were lifted. The requirement for parental supervision on set was officially terminated. The Fox network executives and the Human Resources Department were suddenly entirely absolved of the legal liability they had knowingly harbored since 1998. The problem of her youth had been cured simply by the passage of time. Rather than easing the pressure on the actress, the network simply pivoted its strategy to exploit her new legal status. Because Kunis was now an adult in the eyes of the law, the corporate machine felt entirely liberated. The wardrobe department was instructed to transition Jackie Burkhart's clothing from 1970s teenage apparel to more revealing adult-oriented outfits. The storylines became highly provocative. The studio leaned heavily into her physical appearance, utilizing her as a primary marketing draw now that the threat of child labor violations was completely eradicated. This period marked a significant evolution in the personal dynamic between Kunis and Kutcher. They were no longer an adult and a minor navigating a forced, awkward romance. They were two adults who had survived a unique, shared crucible. They watched each other mature in real time under the intense magnification of global fame. Kutcher watched Kunis navigate her early 20s, transitioning from a heavily managed teenager into a fiercely independent professional who was beginning to secure major long-term voiceover contracts on animated series like Family Guy. She was establishing her own boundaries and taking absolute control of her financial destiny. Simultaneously, Kunis watched Kutcher's career explode far beyond the confines of the sitcom format. He launched the MTV hidden camera show, Punk'd, in 2003, establishing himself as a dominant force in reality television production. He was starring in high-grossing feature films. He became a fixture in the tabloid press, his personal life heavily documented by paparazzi. Through all of this massive external change, their dynamic on the set of that 70s show remained a constant grounding force. They were trusted confidants. The on-screen romance had simply become muscle memory, a clinical chore they executed efficiently before returning to their separate, rapidly expanding lives. But the grueling grind of a multi-camera sitcom eventually degrades even the most resilient formats. By 2004, as the show entered its 7th season, the atmosphere on the basement set was growing visibly tired. The actors were exhausted by the repetitive nature of the production schedule. They had been delivering variations of the same jokes in the same wood-paneled basement for nearly a decade. The writers, sensing the changing tides and the vastly evolving industry status of their actors, finally began to dismantle the corporate pairing that had defined the launch of the series. They fractured the Jackie and Kelso relationship, writing storylines that paired Kunis's character with other members of the ensemble. It was a narrative shift, but it fundamentally reflected the actor's reality. Kutcher's star power and his obligations as a producer had vastly outgrown the ensemble cast. The network could no longer afford to keep him contained within a half-hour comedy. At the conclusion of the 7th season in the spring of 2005, Ashton Kutcher made the definitive decision to step away from that 70s show as a full-time cast member. He declined to renew his contract for the 8th and final season. His departure marked the absolute end of the forced corporate pairing. When he walked off the Fox lot, he left behind the young woman he had watched grow from a terrified 14-year-old child into a 22-year-old industry veteran. They had spent 7 years locked inside a corporate experiment, navigating an incredibly inappropriate workplace dynamic devised by executives who prioritized profit over their well-being. They had survived the ordeal through sheer psychological endurance, forming a deep platonic respect for one another. As Kutcher drove away from the studio to pursue his film and production career, and Kunis remained behind to anchor the final season of the show, their paths physically separated. The cameras stopped rolling on their mandated romance. They had successfully navigated the Hollywood machine, emerging as wealthy, famous, and independent adults. They believed the uncomfortable history of their casting was finally behind them, a strange footnote in their early careers. They had no idea that the media landscape and a massive shift in their personal lives would eventually force them to completely recontextualize the very foundation of their relationship. When the final episode of that 70s show aired in the spring of 2006, the heavy studio doors closed on a defining chapter of network television history. For the cast, the conclusion of the series was not merely the end of a job, it was the sudden removal of the only professional and social structure they had known for their entire young adult lives. Mila Kunis was 22 years old. She had spent exactly 1/3 of her life and the entirety of her formative teenage years standing on tape marks in a brightly lit, artificial Wisconsin basement. Stepping off the Fox lot for the last time, her immediate and most critical challenge was sheer professional survival. The Hollywood ecosystem is notoriously unforgiving to actors who age out of hit sitcoms. The industry possesses a long, brutal history of absorbing young television stars, permanently trapping them in the branding of their most famous characters, and discarding them when they attempt to transition into serious adult roles. Casting directors, audiences, and studio executives viewed Kunis exclusively as Jackie Burkhart, the loud, obnoxious, superficial teenager. To dismantle that deeply ingrained corporate branding, she had to execute a flawless, highly strategic career pivot. She actively sought out projects that aggressively contradicted her sitcom image. She maintained a steady, entirely voice-based income by voicing the heavily abused character of Meg Griffin on the animated series Family Guy, a role she had secured at 15. This provided financial security, allowing her to be selective with her live-action choices. In 2008, she secured a major supporting role in the hit comedy Forgetting Sarah Marshall. The project proved she could hold her own in an unscripted, highly improvised adult environment, entirely separate from the rigid multi-camera sitcom format. But the definitive rupture from her past occurred in 2010 when she was cast in Darren Aronofsky's psychological thriller, Black Swan. The role of Lily, a dark, manipulative, and intensely physical ballet dancer, required a grueling physical transformation. Kunis dropped 20 pounds, trained in ballet for months, and endured a level of psychological depth that network television had never asked of her. The performance was a revelation to the industry. It earned her a Golden Globe nomination and universally shifted her status. She was no longer the child actor from the Fox network. She was a formidable, bankable, leading lady in adult cinema, having successfully broken the sitcom curse that destroys the majority of her peers. Simultaneously, she was fiercely protecting her personal life. The bizarre, highly publicized nature of her teenage years on a network set had instilled in her a deep, permanent aversion to tabloid culture. For 8 years, stretching from 2002 to 2010, she maintained a quiet, intensely private relationship with actor Macaulay Culkin. This partnership was rooted in a very specific shared understanding. Culkin was arguably the most famous child actor in global history. He had survived his own horrific battles with the Hollywood machine, the extreme toxicity of public consumption, and severe parental mismanagement. Kunis and Culkin bonded over the unique, isolating trauma of growing up entirely inside the public eye. They functioned as a closed system, finding a quiet refuge with each other, away from the flashing cameras. They did not walk red carpets together. They did not give joint interviews. Kunis utilized this relationship as a fortress, a necessary psychological boundary to separate her real identity from her highly visible profession. While Kunis was deliberately flying under the tabloid radar and methodically building her film credibility, Ashton Kutcher was experiencing a completely different trajectory. He was living at the absolute white-hot center of the global media circus. After leaving the sitcom in 2005, Kutcher transformed himself into a massive cultural and financial force. He continued to star in high-grossing romantic comedies, but his most significant evolution was happening off-camera. He recognized very early that the dumb Kelso persona was a rapidly depreciating asset. He understood that relying solely on acting in Hollywood leaves an individual permanently at the mercy of studio executives. To achieve true autonomy, he needed capital and leverage. He began pivoting aggressively into Silicon Valley venture capitalism. Kutcher recognized the impending intersection of entertainment and technology long before his peers. He co-founded A-Grade Investments and began leveraging his immense cultural reach and capital to fund tech startups. He became an early aggressive investor in companies like Skype, Foursquare, Spotify, and eventually Uber and Airbnb. The goofy kid who had swept factory floors in Iowa was quietly building a billion-dollar investment portfolio, completely rewriting his narrative from a sitcom punchline to a formidable, highly respected tech mogul. However, it was his personal life that kept him permanently affixed to the front pages of the tabloids. In 2005, he married the iconic actress Demi Moore. The relationship generated a massive, relentless media frenzy, driven entirely by their 15-year age gap. Kutcher was suddenly navigating the highest, most intense levels of paparazzi scrutiny in the world. He was a young man thrust into a highly complex adult marriage. dealing with the pressures of being a stepfather to Moore's 3 daughters, all while trying to manage a rapidly expanding corporate empire and his own acting career. His life was highly documented, heavily analyzed, and constantly consumed by the public. During this expansive, chaotic period from 2006 to 2011, Kunis and Kutcher lived entirely separate existences. The narrative often peddled by romantic comedies is that two people destined for each other spend their time apart quietly pining, waiting for the universe to reunite them. That was not the reality of their situation. They were not waiting for each other. The highly inappropriate, corporate-mandated romance of their youth was a distant, slightly awkward memory. They had lived entirely separate lives, experiencing completely distinct traumas, long-term relationships, career-defining victories, and profound personal challenges. Their communication during this half-decade was remarkably mundane. They kept in touch primarily through AOL Instant Messenger. They were simply two former co-workers who had survived a bizarre corporate crucible together, occasionally checking in online to say hello, ask about each other's families, and verify that the other was still surviving the Hollywood machine. They were friends, but from a very safe designated distance. The complete restructuring of their relationship occurred between late 2011 and early 2012. The geographic and emotional landscapes of their lives violently shifted. Kutcher was going through a highly public, deeply painful, and heavily scrutinized divorce from Demi Moore. The media was dissecting his personal failures, alleged infidelities, and the collapse of his marriage on a global scale. The sheer volume of the negative press was suffocating. Kunis, meanwhile, had quietly ended her long-term, protective relationship with Culkin. They were both newly single, in their late 20s and early 30s, entirely exhausted by the emotional toll of their respective breakups. They were bruised by the industry and navigating a period of profound personal transition. The setting for their reunion was the 69th Golden Globe Awards in Beverly Hills in January 2012. It was a standard high-pressure industry event, populated by network executives, film producers, and the Hollywood elite. Kunis was attending the award ceremony, navigating the crowded backstage areas. According to her own later accounts, she was looking around the room when she saw the back of a very tall man. She noted his posture and the broadness of his shoulders. When the man turned around, her breath caught. It was Ashton Kutcher. But it was not the 20-year-old boy who had awkwardly helped her with her middle school chemistry homework. It was not the goofy co-star who had nervously executed a network-mandated kiss under blinding studio lights to satisfy a test audience demographic. He was a 34-year-old man. He had lived an entire adult life. He carried the weight, the experience, the immense financial success, and the quiet exhaustion of a man who had navigated massive public victories and devastating private failures. For the very first time in their entire history, they were looking at each other not as a minor and an adult trapped in a hierarchical workplace, but as two fully formed, autonomous equals. There were no Fox executives in the room dictating their physical proximity. There was no script in their hands telling them what to say. There was no laugh track waiting to punctuate their conversation. The rigid, highly unethical corporate structure that had defined their entire teenage relationship was completely gone. The dynamic was suddenly entirely their own. They reconnected that night. The conversation flowed easily, built on a foundation of absolute unspoken trust. They had watched each other grow up. They knew exactly who the other person was long before the massive wealth, the critical acclaim, and the global fame had fully solidified. Kutcher, seeking the familiar comfort of someone who understood his core identity outside of his recent tabloid scandals, invited her to a Hollywood house party he was hosting later that week. She accepted. The parameters of their survival had changed, and the final chapter of their shared history was about to begin. The profound irony of Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher's subsequent romance is that they initially attempted to systematically avoid a serious relationship by recreating a cinematic framework they had both just recently monetized. In 2011, Kunis starred in the romantic comedy Friends with Benefits. That exact same year, Kutcher had starred in the nearly identical film No Strings Attached. When they reconnected in 2012, both exiting highly visible, emotionally draining long-term relationships, they explicitly agreed to apply the parameters of those fictional movies to their actual lives. They established a casual arrangement, purely practical, deliberately devoid of emotional entanglement. It was a defensive mechanism. They were two highly exposed individuals attempting to find a safe harbor without risking the vulnerability that the tabloids had so thoroughly exploited in their past. However, the shared history between them, the fundamental trauma-bonded survival of their sitcom years, the mutual respect established in the Fox basement, and the deep, unvarnished understanding of each other's core identities long before the fame solidified, rendered a casual arrangement unsustainable. Within months, the defensive parameters they had constructed collapsed. The transition from former colleagues to a dedicated partnership was swift. They moved in together, choosing to inhabit a quiet, fiercely guarded domestic space. For as long as physically possible, they deliberately obscured this relationship from the entertainment press. They understood the mechanics of the paparazzi better than almost anyone in Los Angeles, and they utilized that knowledge to protect the fragile, entirely genuine connection they had finally established outside the glare of studio lighting. But a relationship between two A-list Hollywood figures operating at the peak of their respective careers cannot remain insulated indefinitely. Eventually, the logistical reality of living together in a heavily surveilled city resulted in photographic evidence. Paparazzi captured images of them walking together, purchasing coffee, and exhibiting undeniable proximity. The photographs were syndicated globally, and the entertainment media apparatus immediately ignited. The realization that Jackie Burkhart and Michael Kelso were dating in real life sent a massive, highly profitable shockwave through the cultural zeitgeist. For an industry that relies heavily on nostalgia to drive engagement, this was the ultimate jackpot. As the glossy magazines began churning out cover stories and late-night television hosts drafted their monologues, a very specific, highly sanitized narrative was constructed by the media machinery. The industry recognized a golden opportunity to package their relationship as a modern Hollywood fairy tale. Entertainment journalists consistently framed their initial 1998 casting as a cute, cosmic coincidence, a stroke of cinematic destiny. Television presenters delighted in broadcasting syndicated clips of their early kissing scenes on the Fox lot, cueing studio audiences to express adoration. They frequently highlighted the trivia that Kunis's first real-life kiss was captured on camera, with her future husband utilizing it as a marketing hook. This narrative was incredibly seductive, highly marketable, and eagerly consumed by a public desperate for feel-good storylines. But critically, this narrative functioned as a massive, retroactive corporate shield for the television networks and the broader studio system. By framing their early relationship strictly through the lens of romantic destiny, the media completely erased the reality of the power dynamics and the ethical breaches that occurred in 1998. The fact that Kunis and Kutcher were now engaged in a healthy, consensual adult relationship in their 30s did not alter the historical and legal reality of their initial casting. It did not change the fact that a major broadcasting network had deliberately compromised standard workplace ethics, bypassed the developmental boundaries of a 14-year-old minor, and placed a 20-year-old man in a highly compromising position simply to protect advertising revenue and test audience data. Hollywood effectively utilized their present happiness to permanently whitewash its own past negligence. The industry pointed to their subsequent engagement, their private wedding in 2015, and the birth of their 2 children as absolute justification for an environment that should never have been authorized in the first place. The prevailing media logic dictated that the ends entirely justified the unethical means. This retrospective justification is fundamentally reliant on survivorship bias. Kunis and Kutcher survived the Hollywood child acting machine. They emerged from a highly inappropriate workplace dynamic without succumbing to the severe psychological damage, financial ruin, or substance abuse issues that statistically claim the lives and careers of so many young performers in the industry. They possess the sheer psychological endurance, the familial grounding, and the necessary luck to navigate the corporate minefield, build formidable independent careers, and eventually find genuine stability with one another. But their individual survival does not validate the system that placed them at risk. Accepting the narrative that forcing a 14-year-old and a 20-year-old to simulate a mature romance is acceptable simply because they married decades later leaves a dangerous precedent intact. It signals to modern casting directors, showrunners, and network executives that bending labor regulations and ignoring the psychological safety of minors is a permissible operational strategy, provided the final product is profitable and the actors do not publicly retaliate. Interestingly, both Kunis and Kutcher have occasionally attempted to dismantle this sanitized narrative themselves. In various long-form interviews and podcast appearances as adults, they have both candidly acknowledged the absolute absurdity of their early working conditions. Kunis has stated on the record that the entire setup was highly irregular and that she was frequently out of her depth as a child surrounded by adults. Kutcher has reiterated the deep, palpable discomfort he experienced executing romantic scenes as a young man with a minor. Yet the media machinery routinely absorbs and neutralizes these honest admissions. When the actors point out the ethical failures of the situation, interviewers frequently pivot, treating the corporate exploitation of a minor as a quirky, amusing anecdote from the deregulated days of the 1990s. The broader culture refuses to hold the network accountable because doing so would require dismantling a beloved pop culture fairy tale and acknowledging the viewer's own complicity in consuming the product. Today, operating in their 40s, Kunis and Kutcher are formidable entities within Los Angeles. They command massive production companies, navigate vast venture capital portfolios, and maintain tight control over their public output. However, the most definitive metric of their worldview is how they have chosen to operate their own family infrastructure. They enforce a strict media blackout regarding their children. They do not publish photographs of their children's faces on any social media platforms. They actively utilize legal avenues to shield them from paparazzi lenses. Most tellingly, they have publicly and unequivocally stated that they will not permit their children to enter the entertainment industry until they are fully grown adults capable of signing their own legal contracts. The couple who met on a network television set when one of them was barely out of middle school has drawn a massive, impenetrable boundary around their own household. Their parenting methodology is a quiet, undeniable indictment of the exact corporate system that created them. They understand precisely how the machinery operates, how it consumes youth for profit, and they categorically refuse to let their children anywhere near the factory floor. The story of Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher is perpetually mischaracterized as a romantic comedy brought to life by the magic of Hollywood. But when stripped of the studio spin, the mandated laugh tracks, and the nostalgic magazine covers, it is fundamentally a documentary study of extraordinary human resilience in the face of rampant corporate exploitation. In 1998, a television network evaluated a vulnerable 14-year-old immigrant girl and a naive 20-year-old laborer from the Midwest and saw nothing but demographic data points and syndication potential. The executives placed them in a deeply unbalanced workplace, actively choosing to ignore standard ethical boundaries because the resulting product was deemed too lucrative to cancel. They treated the psychological safety of a minor and the moral liability of a young man as acceptable operational losses on a corporate balance sheet. The fact that Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher survived this crucible is a testament solely to their own fortitude, their strategic intelligence, and the mutual respect they forged in the trenches of a soundstage. They built a genuine, protective human connection within a corporate environment designed to utilize them as disposable assets. Decades later, when they finally converged as consenting, fully autonomous adults, they constructed a life that was entirely their own, insulated from the dictates of a television script or a studio executive. The history of their casting must remain a cautionary tale rather than a celebrated anecdote. The modern marriage of Jackie and Kelso is not a validation of Hollywood's methods. It is a profound, successful rebellion against them. They took the absolute worst, most ethically compromised corporate situation imaginable and, against all statistical odds, managed to survive it, dismantle the branding forced upon them, and build something undeniably real.